Hi there, Serdar Yegelov here for InfoWorld. In this episode of Smart Python, we're going to look at ImportLib, a standard library module that allows you to import modules and libraries programmatically. Most of the time in Python, when you import code, it's by way of hard-coded declarations at the top of a module. Sometimes, though, you want to perform imports dynamically. For instance, only when a particular module is needed, or when you want to choose between a few possible modules. ImportLib exposes mechanisms to do that within your Python code. Let's start with the most basic use of ImportLib. In this simple example, I'm using ImportLib to import another module by name using a string. The string is hard-coded in this example. It's part of the actual source code, but I could just as easily obtain it from user input or reading from a file or an environment variable or what have you. I also have, in the same directory as this code, another module named other.py. It doesn't do very much. It just prints a message when it's imported, and it has a single variable within it that we could look up by its name. So when I run this main code, here's what happens. ImportLib seeks out a module with the name that matches this string, imports it, and makes it available in the variable other. I can then use other as I would if I had imported it using the usual import command. The only difference is we don't use a hard-coded import statement. Well, except for fetching ImportLib, that is. Now, when we use import module, we're passing a string that is the same as what we would pass to the import statement itself. But if we wanted to import from a Python file by way of a file path, instead of the module name that's used in Python, we would need to do this a little bit differently. So in this second example, I'm showing you here how to import from a file path rather than just a module name, and it uses a slightly different mechanism. It uses the spec from file location utility. And this takes in two parameters. First is the module name we want to use for the file in question, which could include a dot path, for instance, if we're importing a submodule. Second is the path to the file that we want to use for that module. Now, when we do this, it doesn't actually give us the module itself, at least not yet. Instead, it gives us what's called a module spec object. And this is an object that describes to the import system how a given module is to be imported, its name, its origin, and a number of other bits of state that are required to go with it. And then we then use the specs loader object to actually load the module into a variable. And as you can see from when we run this code, we now have other.py loaded and available. So the process of loading from some arbitrary file is a little bit more convoluted, but there are reasons for that. For one, we have to specify what the module's fully qualified name is going to be when we load it. We can't just grab any old file and assign it to a variable. But fortunately, the whole thing can be reduced to a simple recipe like the one we've got here. Now, exercise for the reader. See if you can condense everything here into one line. It's actually not that hard, but I will reveal an answer at the end of the video. Now let's take a look at a more complex example. I have here two modules, other and other2, and I want to load one or the other based on some input at the command line. Other will be selected by default. So in the code for this example, first thing I'm going to do is create a set of all the names of the modules in the directory that match a certain wildcard, other and other2, so that I can compare the user's input against them as a way of verifying that I'm loading something that exists. This is strictly for my own sake. Next, I've got the import mechanism, which I've got wrapped up in a function. And then in the main body of the program, I process the first user-supplied argument at the command line, assuming there is one, and I load the appropriate library based on that input. So if we run this with no arguments at all, we will get other as our default module, because it's specified by default. And if we supply a nonsense argument, we'll get the same thing because other is again supplied by default. But if we supply other2, that will load that second module. So one advantage of loading modules selectively is that if the process of loading a module is expensive, if you have a lot of objects in it or it does a lot of things that might take some time, you can speed things up by only loading the module you need when you need it. And there are also some other mechanisms in Python worth exploring to this end, and I'm going to go into those in future videos. Some of them are in the ImportLib module itself, but they deserve full expanded treatment. Now, I should also point out that one of the big downsides to a dynamic module import is that it makes type hinting a little bit more complicated. Because the import mechanisms are dynamic, anything from a dynamically imported module isn't going to have its type information preserved because the system has no way of knowing what's being imported, and so that information cannot be passed along. Example here, you'll notice other.x in this example, if I hover, is hinted as any. But the variable that we derive from other.x, we can hint directly as integer. So that's one way to work around this, but it's not perfect, and it means that a lot of the ease of use that we would get from the type hinting would get erased if we start using dynamic imports in this fashion. So you have to be careful with it if you're relying on type hints quite a bit. Okay, remember earlier I said there was a way to condense all of this into one line and that it isn't that hard? Well, here is my solution. And you can always wrap all of this up in a function if you want to do that, but this is the quick and dirty way to do it. Now, I imagine anybody who's reasonably conversant with Python will have figured this out, but this should give you an idea of how you can do the whole thing in one step if the need ever does arise. So that's it for this video. We will go into more about importlib in the future, but for now, if you liked it, please leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to the Tech Talk channel on YouTube. And for more Smart Python and more Dev with Serdar, be sure to follow me on Facebook, YouTube, and Infoworld.com.